Good evening, everybody. My name is Kurt Sorensen, and I'm the president of Students Fostering Conservative Thought. I'd like to thank you all for attending to tonight's lecture, and I definitely am excited to see some of the interesting discussion and dialogue that is likely to take place. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to inform you all about a little new development that's been happening here at St. John's University. At the end of the school year last year, Students Fostering Conservative Thought found itself with a little bit of a surplus, and we wanted to do two things. We wanted to honor a great congressman, and we wanted to do something for the students. It turns out these two goals weren't conflicting at all. And so we decided to open the Students Fostering Conservative Thought Mark Kennedy Library. There are 33 books in all of them intellectual, all of them conservative, and none of them are politically correct. So Mark, if you could come forward, I'd like to present to you the citation. And I quote, "To Congressman Mark Kennedy, in honor of your work as a congressman for the 6th District and for the work that you did to further advance the cause of conservatism, we at Students Fostering Conservative Thought would like to honor you with the gift of the SFCT Mark Kennedy Library Series. In the spring of 2007, SFCT purchased 33 books and donated them in your name to the Alcuin Library at St. John's University. Each book contains a plaque with your name, and the Mark Kennedy Library can be found in one place on the library's website for easy access by any student wishing to learn more about the ideology their classes seldom teach. It is our hope that this will foster the intellectual development of conservative students at our fine institution. While many of these readers will simply be better informed of the issues, we hope that some will follow your footsteps in advocating for conservatism in the private sector. Thanks to you, this pathway should be easier and more enlightened." Thank you. Now, as I did the bio for this introduction, I used Wikipedia, and they told me that Mark Kennedy graduated in 1978, but the president of the university says 79, so I'm going to go with him and avoid all further details of his bio. I know that he graduated from St. John's in 1979 and then went on to earn his MBA. After that, he had a very good career in the private sector, and in 2000, challenged the Democratic incumbent for the 2nd Congressional District of Minnesota, and then served as a congressman until 2007. During that time, he was able to inspire a group of students here at St. John's University. It was just after my freshman year, and I turned on C-SPAN. I was watching it with my friends. And throughout the day, people were talking about why we needed to close Gitmo, and they were talking about these allegations of torture by the Bush administration. And then Mark Kennedy took the podium. And he spoke of some reports that he had just heard that 2 of our own servicemen had been killed and tortured. Mark Kennedy asked the speaker where the outrage was. Why was the House in such a fuss about allegations of mistreatment against our enemies and so silent about the mistreatment of our own men and women? Now, they say that people seldom remember exactly what you said in a speech, but they'll always remember exactly how you made them feel. And I remember exactly how I felt on that day. I was proud to have Mark Kennedy as my congressman. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Congressman Mark Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you all for coming here. One of the things that we wanted to do with this series was to make sure we had some mingling of the students with those that have worked on the conservative side of public life. So I think all my staff is sitting in the back. Everybody raise your hand. Everybody turn around and see everybody in the staff. So students have an assignment to make sure you get to see at least one of them before you leave here and follow up with them and say, what is it like to work in politics? What is it like to work in the conservative side? What is it like for being there in the middle of the battle where you got competing ideas going on all the time? So I certainly hope you do that. and I have an address today. They've told me that I'm supposed to speak about 40 minutes, and that's a lot longer than I normally do, so I apologize, but I have a lot to say. And it may actually fall into the politically incorrect category, Kurt, but I guess since we're here with the students fostering conservative thought, and we're here to provide intellectual diversity, that's okay. When I graduated from St. John's, one of the things I did, I went off to business, and the people that had the Minnesota Intercollegiate Athletic Conference magazine asked me, what did you get most out of St. John's that you appreciated? And it was exactly that, the intellectual diversity. So let me begin by saying that when I addressed the class of 2002, I told them that God had something planned for each of them that only we could do, that only they could do, and that if it wasn't done, it would somehow, the world would be incomplete. I want to tell you that I believe that for each of you, but I also believe that there's a special role for the United States of America. And I believe that the role for America is to continually advance the frontiers of freedom, to be that shining city that is an inspiration for everybody around that they aspire to, and to be that person in the world that leads the world towards real peace, prosperity, security. Perhaps I came to this conclusion on the first trip I took out of the state of Minnesota when I was 10 years old. And we went to visit our uncle, Earl, that lived in Virginia. And he was a veteran of Pearl Harbor and a history buff. He took our family all around the historic sites there, to Jamestown, where the first settlers braved that ocean crossing to come what was at that time freedom's frontier, America. He took us to Yorktown, where our upstart nation won its freedom by beating the most powerful nation in the world at the time. And he also took us to Williamsburg, where the legislature there made the motion for independence that became the Declaration of Independence that founded our country on those principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But then in the end, he took us to where freedom is defended. He took us to Newport News Shipyard, and they were building an aircraft carrier there. And for a 10-year-old that never been out of the state of Minnesota, that's a pretty big deal, seeing an aircraft carrier. It's even a bigger deal when it has your name on it, because it was the USS John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier. Now, for this Kennedy kid, that was especially powerful for me because John F. Kennedy was my first hero. I began my life in an all-Irish town, and I was 6 when John died. And I remember one of my earliest memories was watching the funeral on our black and white TV set. And they constantly replayed his inaugural address, so that just became imprinted in my mind. That we dare not forget that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know whether they wish us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, we shall bear any burden, we shall suffer any hardship, we shall support any friend, oppose any foe to ensure the survival and the success of liberty. Now, those words I have had memorized since I was a kid. And if you were at St. John's here with me, you might have heard me say them. Those are the words that form my worldview, and those are the words that I believe America is called. My generation's journey carrying this torch is closer to the end than to the beginning. And sooner or later, your day of picking up that torch is going to dawn. You will be called upon to confront challenges that are at the same time new and unique, but that are rooted in that age-old struggle of freedom and tyranny. To meet these challenges, you must understand them and the fundamental disagreements you will face. As you're aware, there remains a very different points of view as to what America's role is in the world. Some question our values, Some question our means for achieving our values. Some question both. In many ways, it's a basic disagreement between two Johnnies, Eugene McCarthy and Mark Kennedy. We are both probably best known for our bold stands on foreign policies that, though absolutely opposite of each other, represented sincere beliefs. McCarthy captured the imagination of the country for his anti-Vietnam War position during the 1968 presidential election. For my strong advocacy for advancing freedom's frontier, Brit Hume from Fox News called me the most honest Republican in the 2006 election for advocating something that was truly my belief, but politically unpopular and electorally not very beneficial. The goal for this Frontiers of Freedom lecture series is to add that real intellectual diversity to the McCarthy Center, to ensure you hear both sides, so that you can critically evaluate the challenges you face. And my earnest desire is that, as Matt said earlier, that the McCarthy Center becomes known for, first and foremost, promoting standing for the courage of your convictions. My conviction is that America has been and must continue to be a positive force for good in the world. If you look at the historical record, no other country has done so much for so many. Only Britain, our parent, even comes close. It's only if America continues to play that critical leadership role with your generation and future generations that we will live in peace, prosperity, and freedom. The UN has done nothing without America's leadership, proving, as Teddy Roosevelt says, quote, "There is always the tendency to believe that 100 small men can furnish leadership equal to one big man. This is not so," unquote. The Europeans couldn't even address Kosovo, a purely European issue, without U.S. leadership. If you don't believe me, just read the news last week. The Serb, folks on the street didn't even bother to burn down a European embassy. They went after the American embassy because they knew that none of that would happen without America's leadership. China has a 5,000-year history of worrying about China. And India has hundreds of millions of people in abject poverty that should be its first priority. So for better or for worse, the world will continue to look for America for that leadership. Americans on the beaches of Normandy and on countless islands in the Pacific sacrificed greatly to defeat the twin threats of Nazi Germany and fascist Japan. We rebuilt the world savaged by the devastations of World War II. Having studied in both Europe and Japan in the 1980s, I can tell you I heard their appreciation firsthand. Having traveled abroad regularly for more than a quarter of a century, I have advocated for and seen the steady advance of America's ideals: self-government, free enterprise, the rule of law, religious freedom, free press, free assembly, minority rights, and the rights of women. Today, many believe we're in a tough patch. For those of you of college age, you might think this is unique. Well, Churchill and Reagan are today venerated. In their own day, they were highly controversial, even demonized. We celebrate them because they had the courage to take on the conventional wisdom and do what they knew would be the best for the peace, prosperity, and freedom of the world. My purpose today is to give you perspective to help you understand that advancing freedom's frontiers has never been easy, but it has always borne fruit. It has and it will fall to America to lead the world towards the ever-expanding blessings of free people and free markets. My life experiences have constantly reminded me of the profound impact that a strong America, boldly advancing the frontiers of freedom, has had on the world. In 2005, I toured Asia on a State Department mission, landing first at the Incheon airport. The first thing I saw when I came off the plane was a sign for the area of Pusan. Incheon and Pusan, two names that any of the Korean War veterans, many of your grandparents, would tell you about. This was the place where we first met the rising communist threat. In Korea, we sacrificed 4,400 soldiers in the first 2 months, lost 90% of the peninsula, had deployed already every Army division other than the 82nd Airborne. Many said we should give up, but we stayed on, and MacArthur landed at Incheon with the fleet at high tide in a very risky maneuver, because if it had been low tide, they would have all been stranded. That day, I toured a free, democratic, free market friend of America's in Korea that was very appreciative that America understood where the frontier of freedom was in the 1950s and stood in their defense. In the summer of 2004, as congressman, I helped to host a group of German parliamentarians that came over from the Bundestag here to America. And one of our dinner speakers was the ambassador to Germany. And he told the story of being called back to Germany to brief the German government right before Bush was coming to Germany in 2003, soon after the invasion of Iraq. He told me it was very unusual because when he took the cab from the Berlin airport, his cab driver was actually a Berliner. And so he asked the cab driver, he says, "Are there going to be protests there for Bush?" And the cab driver said, "Yeah, there will probably be some anti-American protests," but he didn't know how many. And then the cab driver found out that this guy was from the embassy. So he said to him, he says, "Do you ever get a chance to talk to President Bush? If you do get a chance, carry this message to him. There may be some protesters there tomorrow, but we Berliners know that we wouldn't have the opportunity to protest had it not been for America." He wasn't talking about World War II. He was talking about America persevering in the fight with Soviet communism. He probably lived behind what Churchill called the Iron Wall in his famous 1946 Fulton, Missouri speech. He was probably in the audience when John F. Kennedy came over there in 1963 and stood boldly in front of the Berlin Wall and said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." But the president that he probably remembered the most was Ronald Reagan, who after the malaise of the Carter years came and called Soviet communism what it is, the evil empire, and stood before the Brandenburg Gate in 1987, and despite the fact that the State Department staffers had pulled it out several times, said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And we all joined together in celebrating 2 years later with that cab driver, when because of Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II, the Berlin Wall came down. But the taxi driver's reason for the message to Bush was likely inspired by the similarity he recognized in the criticisms of Reagan. Reagan was faced with loud cries of cynical, defeatist elites whose memories of Vietnam had led them to abandon the idea that America could be a positive force for good. Reagan withstood scathing criticism from Congress, the media, and the universities that he was an imperialistic warmonger who was going to start World War III. As I sat in the Washington Cathedral for Ronald Reagan's funeral, I marveled at the church filled with people who roundly criticized Reagan as he was confronting the Soviet communisms, but on that day were there to praise him. My mind went back to studying in Europe in the fall of 1982 and having to defend Reagan's evil empire speech given at the British House of Commons just months before. Those same students took to the streets in mass protest in response to Soviet deployment of the SS-20. Reagan oversaw NATO's deployment of the Pershing II missiles in West Germany, and the protests were beyond belief. But those same students today are free from the communist threat only because Reagan did. And would the Berlin Wall have come down if John F. Kennedy had not confronted the communists in Vietnam? Last September, I was in Beijing, China, with my son Charles, who is with me here today, a St. John's prep grad like Eugene McCarthy, and then he went to Notre Dame, which isn't a bad school if you can't get into St. John's. You know, we met with the head of the head of the office of one of the largest law firms in America. And this was a guy from Singapore who was educated in England, working at an American law firm in China. A very international guy who big companies paid thousands of dollars an hour to get his advice. And without hesitation, he told me that he was convinced that if America had not stood in Vietnam, that not only would the democracies of Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia be communist, but that Singapore would be as well. This man of the world understood that the frontier of freedom in the 1960s was Vietnam, just like it was in the 1980s in Berlin. He was appreciative that America met the communist threat, stopped its advance, until Reagan could bury the evil empire and capitalism wash over Marxist China. Is the frontier of freedom today on the battle lines facing radical jihadists and the dictatorial regimes that perpetuate the despair that feeds their hate-filled ideology? The lessons of the Reagan confrontation with Soviet communism is that the defense of freedom of frontiers is always controversial at the time. It is only after the passage of time that its merits can be fairly assessed. Churchill offers us 3 lessons. First, that criticism and public opinion are often misguided. We've already talked about the Reagan example. But today I'm going to contribute my first book to this Students Fostering Conservative Thought Library and the corresponding DVD going along with it, particularly if we can get it going here, as Luke's been a soldier doing. And in that book, if you read it or watch the video, you'll learn that throughout the 1930s, Winston Churchill constantly was trying to prod Britain to prepare for the rising German threat. But he was constantly told how far off base he was. And the response that you'll hear is that 90%, over 90% of the British people supported disarmament. So therefore, Churchill must be wrong. So Luke, if we could just play this little short clip here. It's only an hour and a half, so you can take it out of the library and watch it yourself sometime.
After the Great War, we were told that Germany would be a democracy with parliamentary institutions. All this has been swept away. What do you have? Dictatorship. The most grim dictatorship. You have the persecution of the Jews, you have militarism, and appeals to every form of fighting spirit.
Baldwin won't like that. He sincerely believes that Hitler does not want war.
Baldwin.
Not just Baldwin, many others.
Well, they're wrong.
Well, you think so, I think so, but don't underestimate them, Winston. They admire Hitler, genuinely, they won't like it.
Well, they can lump it.
Order! Order!
You have dictatorship. It's grim dictatorship. You have the persecution of the Jews. You have militarism and appeals to every form of fighting spirit.
Germany wants peace.
We have steadily marched backward since the Great War.
We've had enough bloodshed.
Here's a greater. Rivalries are sharper. Military plans are more closely concerted. And because of our disarmament, Britain is weaker.
Order! Order! The right honourable gentleman must be heard.
The war mentality is springing up again. Britain's hour of weakness is Europe's hour of danger.
Mr. Casifer.
Mr. Speaker, Although one is loath to criticize anyone in the evening of his days, nothing can excuse the Right Honourable Member for Epping for having permeated his entire speech with the atmosphere that Germany is arming for war.
Mr. Speaker!
May I remind the Right Honourable Member that a poll conducted by the League of Nations found that over 90% of the British people favour international disarmament.
Hear, hear.
And let us not forget.
So, as the Right Honourable Member was being reminded, over 90% of the British people were wrong, because Britain was not prepared when the Soviet threat came, and as a result, the suffering that the people felt was far greater than it needed to be. The British people had forgotten or wished away the vital truth that, as Teddy Roosevelt said, quote, "The belief that public opinion or international public opinion unbacked by force had the slightest effect in restraining a powerful military nation, or I might add, hostile ideology, is in any course of action, has been shown to be a pathetic fallacy." This fallacy is not only pathetic, it's dangerous. The second lesson we can take is that delay in confronting evil is dangerous. The central premise of Churchill's book, The Gathering Storm, is that World War II was an unnecessary war that could have been avoided on numerous occasions. And as you go through the book, he'll outline occasion after occasion after occasion that it could have been avoided. Had England acted sooner to confront Hitler, the 20th century's death toll would have been a small fraction of what resulted. The undeniable lesson from history's bloodiest century is that most of the bloodshed was caused by acting too late. The most blatant lost opportunity was when Germany violated the Versailles Treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland on March 7, 1936. France and UK at that point were still stronger than Germany and could have easily nipped the aggression in the bud. Hitler's generals advised against the move, saying that the West was certain to respond, and if the West had acted, Hitler would have probably been discredited and quite possibly have been toppled. The West's response was referred to the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN, an act that then, as now, means essentially nothing. When the West did not respond, the cautionary German generals were discredited, Hitler's genius was proclaimed, and a monster was unleashed. Churchill's stated purpose in writing this book was, quote, "to show how easily the tragedy of the Second World War could have been prevented, how the malice of the wicked was reinforced by the weakness of the virtuous, how the structure and habits of democratic states risk lacking those elements of persistence and conviction which can alone give security to the humble masses, how the counsels of prudence and restraint may become the prime agents of mortal danger, how the middle course adopted for the desires of safety and a quiet life may be found to lead directly to the bullseye of disaster." Unquote. My hope is that by reading this book, you can help steer your generation away from the bullseye of disaster. Never have Teddy Roosevelt's words been more true when he said, quote, "Wars are, of course, as a rule to be avoided, but they are far better than certain kinds of peace," unquote. Britain's reluctance to confront Hitler bought 3 more years of peace at the cost of not thousands of lives, not tens of thousands of lives, not hundreds of thousands of lives, not millions of lives, but tens of millions of lives. No act of war caused as many deaths as clinging to the wrong kind of peace. Any student of the 20th century should most fear what Churchill called history's chilling verdict, too late. Before you irrevocably resolve that it was premature for America to enter Iraq, read The Gathering Storm. Perhaps we have averted what would have been a far more threatening, unnecessary future war. Third lesson from Churchill: be the strong horse. This is probably the only point where my heroes agree with Osama bin Laden, because he said on his December 2001 radio address, "When people see a weak horse and a strong horse, they will like the strong horse." Churchill said, "I'm not sure I would have dared to start, but I'm sure I would not have dared to stop." Reagan said, "Of 4 wars in my lifetime, none of them were because America was too strong." And he also said, "Here's my strategy for the Cold War. We win, they lose." I know there's no need to tell a Johnny audience that people will follow winners, not losers. After all, the Johnnies attract more to one home game than the Tommies do to the whole season. But the unasked question in Iraq is not whether we should have gone there. That question is being fully debated. The question that hasn't been debated is, if America loses, who wins? America's continued world leadership depends on its preserving its winning track record, remaining the strong horse. From the beginning, President Bush said the war on terror would be a long war like the Cold War, not a hot war like World War II. Indecisive results, and they were indecisive in both Korea and Vietnam, when pursued with perseverance, allowed an undisputable victory in the Cold War. The peoples of Afghanistan and Iraq, new to freedom, struggled to tame it to the benefit of their citizens. Only unshakable resolve will allow indecisive results in Afghanistan and Iraq to be victory in the broader war against radical jihadists and preserving that American credibility to lead. America is not served by the likes of Harry Reid, who rushed to the floor of the Senate to declare that we've lost in Iraq. America, indeed the world, is best served by those who understand the need to maintain a winning track record, to preserve America's credibility to lead, and our leadership, though imperfect, has bestowed more benefits of peace and prosperity than the world has seen from any other leader. In the end, we'll have to wait on the passage of time to judge our actions in Iraq. But even the indecisive conclusion in Vietnam spawned a revival of the economy with the Asian tigers, and we see now Vietnam moving to free markets. It spawned democracy with 2 increasingly vibrant Muslim democracies of Indonesia and Malaysia. In a similar way, my hope is that the Middle East, previously a region devoid of freedom and hope, will increasingly become open to an embracing of its own people. In this day when the last crisis reported in Iraq by the Star Tribune was skyrocketing home prices and housing shortage with everybody returning home from the refugees, I think we have hope. And I constantly remember a grandma from Baghdad that I met during my service in Congress. In July of 2004, we had a group of Iraqi women come to Congress to try to learn what democracy was like so that they could be more involved in it than they had been in the past. And after we met with this group, one of them spent a half a day with me to find out what democracy was like. So she sat in with me through several of the constituent meetings that we had. And then after several hours, the bells went off and the buzzers went off and it was time to vote. So she was going with me to see what a vote was like. And right before we went, we stood in front of my office to take a picture. And she said she wanted to stand by the American flag. And for the picture, she reached around behind her, grabbed the American flag, and draped it over her shoulders. Seeing the affection she had for the flag as we were walking to the vote, I said to one of my staff, "Do we have a flag we can give this woman from Baghdad?" And they brought me a flag that was flown over our capital in 2003. And so as we were walking, I gave her a flag and I said, "Here's a flag flown over our capital in the year your country was liberated." And even though we were rushing to a vote, she stopped, she hugged me, and she cried. And she cried because for the first time in her life, she could have hope for a better future for her kids, for her grandkids. And I do believe that when we look back in this decade, the thing that we will be most proud of is the hope that we have given people in the region a right to have. Another way in which America has been a blessing to the world is championing, expanding the reaches of free markets, The rising tide of protectionism, a frequent theme in all the presidential debates you hear on the Democrat side, is of grave concern. Since the Depression era, protectionist tariffs significantly prolonged the misery of the Great Depression. America has had the good sense to be the leader on advancing free trade around the world. And I believe it's critical that we continue to do so for three reasons. First, trade has been the primary driver for American prosperity. The post-World War II prosperity that has tripled the real income of Americans has been a result of an explosion of trade. If you read Democrat Thomas Friedman's "The World is Flat," he will say that we must, quote, reject the idea that the solution for exciting careers for the future is to build walls around America and try to preserve today's jobs. America has always been about renewing itself. The pace of change is getting faster, and that requires America to innovate at an even faster pace by creating new products and services and the new jobs they generate, unquote. The second reason is nothing has done more to alleviate poverty. We have a big focus on China and India now, but guess what? Since they got past Mao and Nehru's and Gandhi's, thinking they control the economy and opened up to the free market, they've had an explosion in economic wealth that has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. No amount of aid can lift people out of poverty like opening up to trade. Trade is 40 times bigger flows than foreign aid. Countries that are open to the global economy enjoy a higher standard of living, are more likely to eat better, live longer. Their children are more likely to attend school than work in fields. They are more likely to be able to speak, assemble, and worship more freely, and they are 3 times as likely to have elected their rulers democratically. It seems to me that if the Catholic social justice teaching of solidarity compels us to anything, it compels Catholics to be pro-trade. Third, nothing is more important to prevent future wars. Adam Smith said that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. No two countries with a McDonald's franchise have ever gone to war with each other. They probably couldn't get off the couch, I suppose, but today's conflict springs from those countries that aren't plugged into the world of trade. Using modern internet terms, the ones that are offline, that aren't connected to the world. If you don't like war, and I think all of us don't like war, then you should support the expansion of trade. When people do not understand each other, there is a natural distrust. Among the most likely sources of conflicts are the people in the greater Middle East. And it's no coincidence that that's also among the areas least understood by Americans. The mistakes we have made in Iraq are due to our lack of understanding of the region and its peoples. If you want less American troops to be in that region over your lifetimes, then more Americans need to visit and understand that region. That's why I've been to the Middle East 6 times in the last 5 years, and one of my passions is pressing American companies to be engaged in that region. Yes, there are imperfections in trade, in the terms of trade, but the way we address those is to tear down the barriers of trades that are inappropriate, not put up more to match them. Yes, America has a big trade deficit. We focus on China. Well, guess what? We also have a trade deficit with France and just about every other country in Europe. Having spent the last week in Europe, I just couldn't help but keep repeating myself. And we have a trade deficit with France, with their 2-hour lunches, and they don't. How can that happen? What America needs to do is we need to shut off that hate-monger extraordinary Lou Dobbs on CNN, focus on innovating and selling abroad. I am reminded of attending a ceremony for a scout troop that was getting an award, because one of their members was sick inside the middle of the boundary waters. And they got him out, taking him, his pack, and all their own on all the portages through the boundary waters. And whenever they even thought about complaining, they got a little extra boost from their female guide telling them, "Suck it up, princess." Where are the Horatio Algers of our day? I found one in Chengdu, China. Last year, he was a New York businessman, and his dad came into him one day and he said, "I'm tired of getting up every morning and worrying about China. Get to China and win." We need more people following his examples and have America's focusing on winning, not whining in a flat world. Much has been said of America's reduced standing in the world. Much of it's been overblown. What I have witnessed is that America's credibility in the world has suffered because we have a lack of a global understanding. Note that I did not say that to lead the world, we must not act unless everybody agrees with us. Indeed, the McCarthy Center was established to honor the courageous spirit of standing up for one's belief when one's beliefs are not widely held by others. As Margaret Thatcher said, a lack of consensus can be no excuse for lack of leadership. But where the world has a legitimate beef with America is that we don't understand them. With less than a quarter of Americans having passports, and many of those to visit the beaches of Mexico, and many of our national leaders not having been to the emerging markets of China and Russia and India and Brazil, America is at best driving the world looking through a cloudy windshield. In a democracy where the people choose their leaders and the leaders respond to the people, we need more than just a Secretary of State going around the world. It's incumbent upon all American citizens in this land of we the people to do so. St. John's, St. Ben's has great study abroad programs. I'd encourage you to participate in them, but do more. Putting a priority on yourself being globally aware will be good for you in a career in an increasing global world, but it will also make you a better informed citizen and our country a more informed leader. For the rest of the world to follow a country, it must be committed to benevolent ideals. Rome sought to conquer, Britain sought commercial advantage, very similar to China's current-day foreign policy. America has always believed that it was our special mission to advance democracy and free markets around the world. Our flag has always stood for freedom. Yet the lack of confidence in rampant secularism has sapped the underpinnings of our commitment to the Western values that even during my lifetime, the world has rushed to embrace. With the global rush to democracy and free markets, too many Americans place no value in these ideals. The atheist leader of the Italian Senate and Pope Benedict joined hands to confront this attitude, saying that today it seems, quote, better is prohibited and only used when talking about ties or desserts. And tolerance becomes indifference. They question, if there's only your truth and my truth, and nothing that we jointly agree is the truth, then how is the West to say that its achievements of equality before the law, tolerance and civility, religious freedoms, the rights and conscience, and democracy and self-government are better? These values, long associated with the West, do have universal applicability. Some cultures have more experience with freedom than others. Some take longer to adapt. But I believe that the yearnings for freedom are written on the heart of every human being, and that countries that embrace these ideals will find that they are beneficial to their citizens. It is America's commitment to these ideals that is vital to her credibility to lead, and to which she must remain committed. America's commitment to the ideals of freedom, our strong economy, ability to project power, and a winning track record will always make it so that nations look to us for leadership. Yet we are not a leader unless we remain willing to confront difficult threats. This, then, is the ultimate test of leadership. Will our country have a Harry Truman, the buck stops here attitude, or will we naively ignore and cowardly cower in the face of threats or to world peace? Yes, one must be prudent and act with as many people as we can get to go with this, as many as the mission permits. But when action is required, a leader must rise to meet the challenge. Let me conclude by telling you a story of one of the most enjoyable experiences I had in my first term in Congress. And that was to fly out aboard the USS John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier in the summer of 2001, 34 years after that family vacation when I saw it being built. It was quite a memorable experience. In order to land in an aircraft carrier, many of you probably know it, but for those you don't, the plane has to drop an arm with a hook at the end of it. And that hook has to catch one of the cables that's strung along the flight deck. And just in case the hook doesn't catch, the plane has to land full throttle so it can take off again if it misses. So you come in and you go from 170 miles an hour to 0 in 2 seconds. 1, 2. And then after you take your stomach back up out of your feet, and the bottom of the plane drops open, and you come out on this heaving, wind-blown flight deck, crowded with F-A-18 Hornets and F-14 Tomcats, and the flight crew is standing at attention welcoming you aboard. And you tour this ship, which is really a small city, over 5,000 people aboard. Then you do night flight operations from a balcony in the middle of the flight deck. And as you look out into the wind, into the black of the ocean night, and you haven't seen black unless you've been in the middle of the ocean on a ship or driven at night in western South Dakota. But you look up and you see the towers twirling around and keeping that ship in the middle of the ocean in contact with people around the world. And you look down on the flight deck, and off one side they're catapulting off ships. And off the other side you look, and then just out of the black comes a jet, full throttle, slams on the deck, gets jerked to a stop, and quick hustled away to make room for the next one. And as I was there watching this, I said to myself, how many people in America know that we have a dozen aircraft carriers at all times standing guard over our freedoms? And then, in the summer of 2001, before 9/11, I dare say, not many Americans, with their busy schedules and backyard barbecues, gave those brave sailors and aviators even a passing thought. And I questioned to myself, did America forget who we are? Did we forget that we are the sole superpower? That we are the country with the only military with a global reach and technology that far surpasses any of our opponents? That we're the country whose sacrifices for freedom has spread it around the world to countless countries? That we're the country with over a quarter of the world's output coming from America? That we have the language that we share with our parent that is the lingua franca of everything from air traffic control to entertainment? The country whose culture, whether you're talking movies or television or internet, fast food, cola, Starbucks, dominates the world? A country whose century-long experiment with democracy has transformed the world and created, for all its faults, the most stable government in the world. A country whose influence has allowed peace and prosperity to spread under Pax Americana on a level that Rome and Britain could have only have dreamed of. Despite our own forgetfulness about who we are, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda didn't forget who we were. They knew that we were freedom's defenders. The good news is that when America was awakened on 9/11, the men and women who wear the cloth of our country had not forgotten either, and they were ready to respond, and we owe them our undying appreciation. We must never forget again. We should always remember that Rome fell because it lost control of its frontiers. America is the guardian of freedom's flame, and we will continue to be a beacon so long as we forget, never forget, to defend and advance the frontiers of freedom. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You all get gold stars for listening to a serious topic late at night. Now I'm sure there must be a question or two out there. Who's got the first question? Well, while you're thinking about questions, I did want to say that as we kick this off, one of the things we talked about was honoring the brave souls on campus that stand up for beliefs that aren't always mainstream. So one of the traditions we want to start is to present an award to a student, and we'll come up with a mechanism for the future. But for this year, I'd like to present to Kurt. So Kurt, do I have the, right behind me? Since he started a library, he must like books. So I have 4 books here that we're presenting to Kurt as the first Frontiers of Freedom Award to a student at St. John's. And these are from my 4 heroes. We have here The Profiles in Courage from John F. Kennedy. We couldn't find Why England Slept, where he could have told you the same story that Churchill just showed you. We have here Theodore Rex from Teddy Roosevelt, and a copy, your very own copy, of The Gathering Storm by Winston Churchill. We'll give you a quiz on it next year. And When Character Was King on Ronald Reagan. So Kurt, thank you and congratulations on the first recipient. Now that was just buying you some time for questions. Anybody have the first questions? That's my brother David. He'll get it later. Anybody else? You had something to say, David?
Well, since you don't recommend Blue Dots as a way to expand your global awareness, what magazines or websites or where do you?
It's a very good question. You know, I say the best thing to do is travel, and when you travel, talk to people, and taxi drivers are a good source, but ask them questions. Don't tell them stuff. Ask them, and amazing what you'll learn. I'm always asking people, what do you think of America? What do you think of Bush? What do you think? And it's amazing the stuff you get. The Economist is a great magazine that covers the global world. If you read that cover to cover, you'll be more informed than most people in the State Department. Financial Times does a good job. And those are 2 places that I would say are great places to go, plus travel. Any other questions? Well, if not, I just want to thank you all for being here. We had a question? I'm sorry, wait, over here?
I was wondering what your view is of the recent elections in Pakistan, where I think that Musharraf's party was discredited and they, like some other, the Pakistan People's Party and,
They had 2 of the opposition parties that have the majority in the parliament. I mean, I think if you look at that, when we first got into the war on terror, we had no relationship with Pakistan at all whatsoever as a country. A lot of people have criticized the relationship we'd had with Musharraf. But what did the election say? An unusual thing in a third world country, the party in power didn't win. And that is a celebration for democracy, and something that I think we ought to celebrate as saying, here's an example where the election didn't come out the way the party in power wanted, which tells you it was probably the reflection of the people. I think we need to work with that. I think we need to work and advance Pakistan towards democracy as quickly as we can. But I think the fact that you even had an election that you could legitimately call was reasonably fair is a great milestone and an achievement of what I'm hoping for, freedom to be spreading through more of that region.
My question has to do with Cuba, and in your speech you were talking about how important it is for people to go to other countries and understand what these other people are thinking. But with Cuba we've had
Well, I think we want to reintegrate it as quickly as possible, and this is the moment we've all been waiting for him to pass the baton. We need to reach out to them as much as we can, but what you'll find is a lot of times it's pushing on a string. He's been hearing anti-American stuff for decades in Cuba. So it might almost be like sometimes when you're raising your kids, you tell them what you don't want them to do because then they'll do it. So we're going to, I shouldn't give those secrets away now while they're in the room, but I think that's something we need to do. And I think you are going to see an opening up and hopefully grabbing this opportunity in Cuba in the years ahead. Cuba is obviously something that Kennedys have spent a little bit of time with. You know, this is one of the few areas where Patrick Kennedy and I actually voted the same way. We have the Kennedy block on Cuba. But
I was just going to ask a follow-up. Do you think that this is an effective tool to instigate the different countries to act?
Which?
Sanction, separation from American economy and people.
You know, do you like war?
Me, no.
Yeah, so if you don't like war and you have to have some tools ahead of time, you know, they're not good. They're not perfect. I happen to think that a lot of times unilateral sanctions by America hurt only America. So that's where the degree to which we can get more countries to come on board is better. But let me just tell you a story about Syria. I'm in Syria meeting with a group of business people, and they're bragging to me about how safe it is in Syria. I say, you know, when you're in a dictator state, you know, it's amazing how nobody wants to do anything because they just soon live. And they were complaining that we had sanctions on Syria, and the GM dealer was complaining because he can't get his GM replacement parts. And so I'm telling him, I said, you know, what you need to have somebody in a GM dealership, a mechanic in a GM dealership in any of our congressional districts that knows something else about Syria other than that they're sponsored terrorism. And he says, well, don't let politics get into this. And I said, don't let politics. You know, you've got terrorist offices in downtown Damascus. And it is a concern. So I do believe there are very select purposes. As a free trader, I agree with you. I want to use sanctions as little as possible. But as a step towards, in a way to put pressure on, short of using military force, I think it is an option that in rare instances we need to keep. I think the escalating tightening of the screws on Iran is having some effect, and I hope that we can, with a very young population that I believe likes freedom in Iran, spark the same thing in Iran that happened in Pakistan, that the party who wins is not the party who's in power. Other questions? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Well, I think if you look at the problem and how big it is, the answer is both. And if you look at Colombia and the success in a very difficult situation has been phenomenal. And you've made great progress in Colombia. Getting back to my trade point, Colombia is a friend. It's in a precarious situation. Their drug lords are constantly going after the government. Do you think we could maybe get a trade agreement passed with Colombia? But right now, for over a year, the Colombian trade agreement, where they largely have access to our markets, but giving it would be a benefit to Colombia, has been stalled because of the anti-trade mentality that's currently in the Congress. So I think, first of all, we need to continue to support the Colombian effort to combat drugs in their own country, and I have consistently during my term in Congress. Secondly, we got to get that Colombian trade agreement passed. But third, when you look at drugs here, I have to tell you, one of the landmark memories of my campaign, I was selected as the Congressman of the Year by the National Narcotics Officers for my efforts in going after drugs. We were at the Fitzgerald Theater where Garrison Keillor does his show from. We're having this debate, one of the last debates of the election. A person asked the question of, what do you think we ought to do with methamphetamine? My opponent from Fergus Falls, the Independent, spent his time talking about how we ought to legalize marijuana. I opened up my remark saying methamphetamine is a killer drug. It ought to be eliminated, not legalized. And somewhere between a third and a half of the audience in the Fitzgerald Theater booed. And I said to myself, what state do we live in? And when you're talking about what a devastation that America's consumption of drugs is causing for Colombia, combined with what it's doing to mess up people's minds and lives, it is something that I don't think we are taking seriously enough. And I agree with you that we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to Colombia and every other country that is suffering because we're not grabbing control of our war on drugs, and we need to redouble our efforts. Any other questions? Well, if not, I just want to say thanks, everybody. I look forward to bringing in future speakers that will hopefully challenge your minds. I was talking to some in the House of Parliament, so hopefully we're going to bring in some foreign leaders in here as well to give their perspectives. I spoke in a group at the House of Lords last week and invited the Shadow Defense Minister from the Tory party to come here and talk. I want to have this be a stimulating place because I think when you have multiple ideas floating around and a chance to digest them and think about are they good, are they bad, it's going to make you better students, better prepared to meet the world, and to continue that tradition of Johnnies and Bennies being actively involved in the public life. So appreciate you all being here today. Look forward to working with you in the future.